Hello everyone and welcome into the final show of the week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am Christopher Shepard, your host. Thank you all yet again for tuning in. And for our final show of the week, we have a good one. We're continuing this narrative of finding the top player from each position. As you all know, I love doing my rankings each week, but I want to kind of limit it to one player before you set your lineups. So, as always, going to start off this Friday's show with my favorite starts and sits of the week as well. But I'm also going to continue to update you on the NFL and college football games with the hugest fantasy implications for this weekend. There's a lot of good games in college and a lot of good games in the NFL. And then, to conclude, as always, I'll give you a little bit of fantasy advice, specifically in the start-sit department for Sunday Night Football. A couple things have changed around, much like what happened last week when all of the hubbub surrounding that game led me to kind of change my tune on the cuff here. Same thing for this game as well. A lot of different things going on there. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if you want to see more exclusive short content or just more podcasts in general, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all concerned in the network. However, if you want to interact with the show more directly through our live streams, make yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. You can do one of two things to contribute throughout the show. You can click the $ in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or you can just leave a burning question, comment, or concern that I will be able to see in my chat box right here that I'll be able to read aloud. It is greatly appreciated yet again in any capacity in which you choose to contribute to the show. It just makes it that much better. Without further ado, let's jump into our first segment of the day concerning my favorite starts of the week. So as always, same kind of story here. Like I said, throughout the weeks, I'm going to be ranking certain players at different positions. And on Fridays, I'll be taking one player from each of those position groups and naming them as either my favorite start or favorite sit. Actually, it only works with the favorite starts because this is the first time you're hearing about the guys who I definitely think you should bench. But for the favorite starts of the week, all guys whose names you've heard before on my shows leading up to this week 9. But without further ado, let's tell you what ones are the best ones for you. Starting off at the QB position. This one is pretty easy. Matchups-oriented kind of guy. Not someone who I feel is going to get caught up in the quote-unquote trap game nature that the Jags will present. Jalen Hurts. And yes, that whole trap game narrative is something that should stick in the back of your mind. The Jags are still a tough out no matter who they play. They kind of grind you into their game and take advantage where they may. But it's proven that Jalen Hurts, no matter how erratic he seems at times, is someone who can't lead this Eagles team to wins against opponents such as the Jags. If you can take care of the football, be efficient, like we've seen in these past couple of weeks, then he's more than capable of leading the charge for the Eagles. We've seen it against the Bengals, and we'll probably see it this week against the Jags, where this offense, when it's at its best, is very efficient, it's very scary, and it's very difficult to beat. And while the Jags should be able to stick around in this one, I don't think it's going to be for long, and I think Jalen Hurts will be the reason. And it's not just because of his arm, it's because of his legs as well. Sustaining drives with his ability to be that dual threat player that they need, and in the red zone as well, being able to add that physicality to his kind of dual threat abilities in that area of the field will certainly take its toll upon this Jags defense that already is kind of in a position where they're not in an advantageous scenario whenever they step on the field. They know that their backs are up against the wall. They know that they're going to be the worst unit on the field when they face opposing offenses. So when you see someone like Jalen Hurts, it just makes it that much more difficult. And I think this will be the game that Jalen Hurts proves that he is finally someone who can get over the hump in terms of turnovers and truly take control of football games he's supposed to. That's why I think Jalen Hurts is my favorite start of the week out of all the QBs that I talked about previously. But then, the second position, the running back position. How about a guy who we're going to be talking about a bit later in the show, playing on Sunday night, another primetime game for his team, Aaron Jones, the Minnesota Vikings, taking on the Indianapolis Colts. Again, yet another matchups-oriented one. This one is just because the Colts' run defense has been appallingly bad this season, and I see no way in that Aaron Jones can't have a big game, because he is someone who has really changed the tenor of this Vikings offense. I feel like without a guy like Aaron Jones, this Vikings offense, at least at the start of the season, is entirely one-dimensional. And the reason why I say that at the start of the season was because his role was more important. And, tonight's game could see the return of TJ Hawkinson, which adds a little bit more variety to this Vikings offense. But I still think this pick holds merit here, because going forward, Sam Darnold's not going to look as comfortable as he has to start the season. He's already not looked comfortable these past 2 games in certain moments. So Aaron Jones is going to have to be someone to carry a little bit of the load a little bit more often than we've seen to start the season. And it's going to be difficult because, as we all know, the Vikings are very capable of throwing the football. But it's going to take a little bit more from each and every one of these offensive skill position players to really make me think the Vikings, if they get to the playoffs, can make some noise there. And so Aaron Jones is going to be an X factor for the rest of the season. Look for him to continue to have solid games against weak run defenses and continue to prove why he is someone the Vikings can rely upon when the odds are stacked against them and when things might get a little bit rough in the goings. At the wide receiver position, this is a little bit of an interesting one, a little bit off kilter considering his struggles this year, but I think in this matchup against the Bills, I'm kind of contradicting myself on because I picked the Bills, I believe, some of the defenses that I think should be a viable start this weekend. But I think Tyreek Hill is someone who can, get that Dolphins offense going. And I feel like, yes, the Bills are perhaps the most willing defense against the Dolphins to just sit back and let Tua make the mistakes for them. But in this game, there are going to be instances where Tyreek Hill can take advantage of the thinness at the linebacker position, combined with, how often they try and disguise coverages to create big explosive plays on the field. And let's not forget, Tyreek Hill is not just a deep ball threat. He is someone who's a savvy route runner and can get open in areas where he may not seemingly have an opportunity to. He's always someone who can extend a play, can help his QB out, and not just be concerned about getting that one big moment that the Dolphins seem to have in every one of their games. So I feel like, yes, it's going to be another challenge because all the momentum with the Bills, it seems that they've already got this division locked up. But the Dolphins have a sense of rejuvenation now. Yes, they lost their first game with Tua back against a very weak Arizona Cardinals team. But not for nothing, I still feel like they have merit in these kinds of games where, you can find the moments where Tyreek Hill can be explosive and electric down the field. You can find the moments as well where he's going to have to be patient. So look for him to kind of wear down this Bills defense in certain moments when you never know what to expect. So that's why I feel like, even though this is a risky pick, it's one that I can't ignore when I think about how the Dolphins could game plan for this one. Then at the tight end position, this is a guy who's recently rounded into form, been getting a lot more opportunities, well, with injuries in his team, Cade Otton. And I like this matchup a lot for him against the Chiefs because I feel like while the strength of the Buccaneers offense right now definitely lies in its running backs, I feel like you have to challenge the Chiefs with physicality in their front because we all know they can stop the run. They have a lot of physical, strong, powerful players on their defensive front that you have to account for. Or if you can account for them, you have to find ways to get the ball out quickly if you're Baker Mayfield. And Cade Otton is someone who I feel like can exploit some of the things that the Chiefs can do. Because if they load the box, they want to limit, Baker's time in the pocket, because that's what makes Baker Mayfield so special. That if he gets enough time in the pocket, he can pick you apart. But if he has to operate out of structure, he also can make plays happen down the field. So if that's their game plan, to try and frustrate Baker Mayfield, keep him within the pocket, then you're going to have to get the ball out very quickly. And Cade Otton is someone who I feel like can be physical enough to exploit the soft spots in coverage or extend the field a little bit in seam route situations. So look for him to be active in this matchup. And I feel like while the Bucs might not be able to win it outright, they're going to definitely keep it closer than a lot of people expect. The Chiefs aren't necessarily a quote-unquote world beater in their unbeaten start. There are moments where they've shown their vulnerabilities. Maybe not so much on defense, but Cade Otton is someone who is a very special player at the tight end position because of what he can bring in the receiving game in many different aspects. So that's why I think he's my tight end one this week in fantasy. And the defense and special teams to close out the show. The close of the segment, rather. Another matchups-oriented one with the Commanders' defense taking on the Giants. I feel like this Commanders' defense is finally rounding into form. It's one that, hasn't necessarily had the challenge outside of the Ravens of facing a offense that's versatile enough to really confuse them. But they have shown the ability to limit damage, to take opportunity of certain areas of the field, and ultimately generate takeaways. And against the Giants, like I said a couple shows ago, you can find different moments to kind of take advantage of the Giants' sloppiness in certain areas, especially in the red zone. But we saw against the Steelers is indicative of what the Giants can be when, they implode. And I think it's the biggest part of why any defense going up against the Giants' offense has hope and has merit. No matter how bad they are, how mediocre they've been to start the season, this Commanders' defense is one that I feel like is in a perfect time to take advantage of the wins they need to further cement themselves as the team to beat in the NFC East. And they're not going to slip up against the Giants. So that's why I feel like this matchup works out perfectly for them, and they should be a defense you should definitely consider starting for your fantasy squad this weekend. Let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. Coming up next, though, we have to transition from the starts to the sits. Which players do I think could sit on the sidelines this weekend for you in fantasy and might have to wait for their turn in your team? We'll be right back to talk about that right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you again that if you wish to interact with my show or any other shows around the network directly, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either click the $sign in the comment section, leave a tip or donation, or through the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Comment anything concerning the show or anything concerning your fantasy football exploits. It's a great way to interact with my show and others. Greatly appreciated, and most importantly, makes this show that much better. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here, transitioning from the starts to the sits. We always have to talk about the negative aspects of fantasy football somehow, and unfortunately, these 5 players at each position that I've picked aren't necessarily, favorable options for you in this week. So without further ado, let's talk about them. At the QE position, Bo Nix unfortunately finds himself on my sit list. Now, I know that there are opportunities there to be had for him in the pass game against this kind of confusing Ravens pass defense, one that hasn't really gotten going, and it's been one of the parts of Bo Nix's game that has been improving steadily over these past couple of weeks, especially in the play action. We can take advantage of moving out of structure, creating plays with his legs, but I just feel like at some point this Ravens defense will round into form and Bo Nix will get a little bit ahead of himself. These past couple of weeks we've seen great growth and maturity from him, but he hasn't really played anyone noteworthy. And in this Ravens team, it's going to make him play catch-up. And when you have to play catch-up against a team like the Ravens, you're going to find yourself forcing things a lot, especially in the offensive side of the football. So look for Bo Nix to potentially be a little bit more erratic than he's been these past few weeks against a team that actually knows how to drive in the football field, score points, and most importantly, close you out. Well, not entirely in some regards, but at least in certain ways, knows how to put up points and how to, most importantly, win football games. Enough football games to, maybe not mentioning their close game reputation. But Bo Nix, nevertheless, finds himself on the sit list because of that factor. Now, for the running back position, this one's a little bit of a weird one because we don't necessarily know how the Packers are going to play this. We don't necessarily know if Jordan Love will start this game, even though it's looking more and more likely that he could. But in terms of how this looks for Josh Jacobs, I feel like if you're the Packers, either way, no matter which quarterback you go with, you're going to have to feel like you have to throw the football more often than you like. Because Josh Jacobs is a great weapon, and yes, the absence of Aiden Hutchinson, there's a lot of questions surrounding the Lions' run defense and how they can stop certain running backs, especially a guy like Josh Jacobs who's very physical with his running style. But the fact that there's so many questions now surrounding who's going to play quarterback for the Packers come Sunday leads me to believe that Josh Jacobs' status could be ever-changing and so volatile in this game. There could be moments where they might need him to try and wear down this Lions defense if they're still in the game. But if they're playing catch-up, if they're falling behind in this one, they're going to have to, either way, whether it be Love or Willis starting, throw the football on the field to try and keep up with the Lions. Because we know the Lions are going to score in this game, no matter how impressive the Packers' defense has been in terms of generating takeaways. But Josh Jacobs just feels like one of those players who his status is just too volatile and interchangeable that we don't necessarily know how solid of a choice he'll be in our fantasy squads. So that's why I feel like he's someone who I'm comfortable with saying, okay, maybe I have to sit him this week because of what the Packers look like headed into this game. And it's a sad one because he's a special fantasy talent. He's someone who sits kind of on the periphery of two different tiers, that tier 2, tier 3 kind of situation. But he is someone who, this week at the very least, doesn't necessarily look to project to be someone who I would play in my fantasy squad. Then the wide receiver position. This one is unusual as well because this isn't necessarily a matchup you would say CeeDee Lamb would necessarily quote-unquote lose, but it is one that I feel like because of the struggles of this offense could prove to be very frustrating for CeeDee Lamb. Yes, the Falcons' pass defense has not lived up to par, but I feel like, in a way, the Cowboys' offense just finds ways to cater to opposing defenses no matter their style. I feel like Dak is too uncomfortable in certain situations. He doesn't necessarily trust any other receivers outside of CeeDee Lamb, or he can't necessarily get the ball to players that he might want to incorporate them into this offense. So it just leaves this weird kind of gap and gray area between what the Cowboys offense could look like and what it really is. And so I feel like right now it's unusual to say that CeeDee Lamb will find himself on my sit list this week. But even against a Falcons defense that can be scored upon easily, I feel like if you can't open up avenues where you don't have to rely on CeeDee Lamb too much, but he's still someone you have to account for, then I don't see how that sense of variance in this Cowboys offense that's missing can contribute to positive aspects for their two contract players. If you can't prove that Dak and CD can perform within the structures of an offense rather than just as individuals, then there's really no hope in the Cowboys being diverse enough to where you can say, okay, maybe CD can become more matchups oriented. I can pick and choose when and how to use him in my fantasy squad instead of just hoping and praying that week in, week out, he's going to be the superstar wide receiver we know he is. So that's why I'm kind of confused on how to rate CeeDee Lamb going forward. But for now, in this weird matchup, he's on my sit list for Week 9. The tight end position, even though I projected his quarterback to be one of my favorite starts of the week, Dallas Goedert is slowly losing his luster that he kind of gained mid-season, where he looked like one of the top weapons for the Eagles going forward. And I feel like he still could be in certain moments, but I just feel like the Eagles' best offensive performances have stemmed from the ability to be efficient and explosive at the same time. We saw it against the Bengals, where Jalen Hurts wasn't afraid to go deep, but he also knows what he has in the backfield with Saquon, and he knows that he can have different weapons help him in, say, short to intermediate areas of the field as well. Dallas Goedert is one of these weapons, but against a Jaguars team that can frustrate you, I feel like they're going to try and take away what they know they can, and that is the short to intermediate areas of the field. I don't know how they'll hold up on islands against receivers like A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, but if they try and remain compact in the middle of the field, then I see frustrating moments for guys like Dallas Goedert in this game. So it truly depends on how the Jaguars really present their defense on the day. And not for nothing, I feel like, it's going to be tough trying to ignore what A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith can do. But I think that, A, you need to try and confine the short and intermediate areas of the field, but B, you also have to worry about Jalen Hurts, like I said, his legs, and how he can compete out of structure. So they're going to focus a lot on A, generating pressure, but B, making sure that short to intermediate areas of the field are availed to Jalen Hurts. So that's why I feel like Dallas Goedert is not necessarily someone I have high hopes for in this matchup. But I'm not necessarily condemning him to tight end 4-5 status. He still is someone who merits conversation in terms of a starting tight end, because this is one of the more interesting markets in the fantasy landscape because of how much depth there is and how much depth there's proven to be this season outside of, the big guns at the top. So Dallas Goedert is someone who week in, week out might find himself on either one of these lists based off of the Eagles' performance as a whole, because Not only is Dallas Goedert one of the weirdest tight ends, the Eagles are one of the weirdest teams in the NFL. And so we can't necessarily gauge how certain position players for them can pan out week by week, especially when you know they haven't had the toughest of schedules for any team. Especially going into this week against the Jags, we know that they'll have their matchups. It's just a matter of which matchups won't be there for them going forward. Then the final defense that I want to talk about in terms of a sitting perspective in fantasy is the Green Bay Packers. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is still a team that I know is one of the best in terms of generating takeaways. Lead the league, I believe, in takeaways. Stephen McKinney, their star corner, leading the league in interceptions. Jair Alexander, not far behind. But this is the Lions we're talking about. And no matter how they win, I feel like the inevitability of them winning is starting to take hold. No matter how they come at you. Because they have at least 3 to 4 different game plans. They have a game plan where they can ground you in submission like they did against the Seahawks. They have a game plan where they can beat you on special teams like they did with the Titans. They have a game plan where they can pass the football well like they did against the Vikings. They have so much versatility. Ben Johnson is so comfortable as their offensive coordinator now that he's in his bag most games. And every single coordinator, Aaron Glenn, I don't know the name of their special teams coordinator, but him as well, Dan Campbell even, has this group playing some of the best football they've ever played. And that's a daunting task for any defense. Even a defense that's confident they can at least create plays in their defense, like the Packers. That's why I feel like, even though the Packers are a defense that might be popular this week, as people truly want to see the Lions tested in every single department, I don't necessarily think they have the depth and experience that people think they do. I think they're finally going to be proven as paper tigers, and there are going to be some vulnerabilities and flaws we have not seen thus far for this Packers defense. But let me know what you think in the comments about my sits for this week. They're very different in terms of what I see in my starters that I feel like makes them stand out, in that they're all in just very difficult predicaments and scenarios for their teams and for themselves. So that's why I feel like my sits are so important. But when we come back after the break, we get into implications, starting off with the NFL and the fantasy implications on certain games there, and then getting into the college football landscape as well. Be right back to this short break to talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, we are getting into our implications, namely fantasy implications for the biggest games of the weekend in both the NFL and college football. And we start off in the NFL, and I picked 4 games, a lot of divisional games as well, but a couple that I'm looking for certain aspects of teams' games to thrive or falter. And this is kind of one of those segments where I'm not just talking about the positives of how this game could look from a fantasy perspective. I want to get into the negative aspects now as well, because a lot of these divisional matchups are going to be grueling affairs going forward, especially if the divisions are hotly contested as some of these are. But at the end of the day, I feel like these are just an offering to you to get you starting to think about certain matchups, maybe some apprehensions you have going into the game, some last-minute decisions that you might want help with. These are the games that I feel like a lot of people will have fantasy hopes in, and thus I just want to present them from a lot of different perspectives. Without further ado, let's jump right into my Week 9 NFL games, with the biggest fantasy implications. Starting off with a big rematch in the AFC East. Maybe not as big as the last one, but certainly a big one in terms of, the history, the rivalry, but most importantly, the return of a certain player. Nope, that's the wrong graphic. Dolphins, Bills. Now, I say that Tua's health was paramount. This was obviously made before, we knew about the true status of Tua's comeback. But it's still something to monitor because remember, this was the game in which Tua was concussed. Now, it was also the game where Tua potentially had his worst performance in a Dolphins uniform in his career. And it was also one where we saw how special the Bills' defense could be, but also how once depth is called into question for the Bills, especially concerning all the injuries that's happened with them, especially at the linebacker position, how they potentially could be beaten if you have a relaxed quarterback. And so far, the Dolphins this season have not had relaxed quarterback play. And they're hoping that the return of Tua can give them their best opportunity to continue to try and find their way back into the AFC playoff picture, because we know that the Bills are not necessarily going to blow this lead in the AFC East. If they win this game, will have the head-to-head tiebreaker 2-0, and thus there'll be really no path where the Dolphins can get in winning the division. So they'll have to try and sneak into the wild card should they lose this game. This game is all about keeping Tua upright, Tua diagnosing certain things in the Bills' defense that he didn't before. Most importantly, trying to get his weapons, who a lot of fantasy football managers relied upon starting the season, going again. Because a lot of people in fantasy do not like stagnation from certain players, especially those he believe could be your big guns week in, week out, like your Hills, like your Achans, like your Waddles. So this is all about Tua, though. If Tua can't get going, then this offense can't get going either. Because without Tua willing to put in the work, without a Tua who's healthy enough, who's becoming smarter in certain areas of his game, then this Dolphins team really does have no hope right now. And they may be looking at a situation where with a high draft pick, they could be drafting Tua's successor. That's how dire this game could look should the Dolphins not win. On the Bills side of things, we already know how skilled this team is in terms of their talent. So I'm not necessarily concerned about the Bills from a fantasy perspective because we know what Josh Allen can do. We know what their weapons can do. Especially, a guy like James Cook, who's been a shocking revelation at the running back position for a lot of players on fantasy, myself included. So I'm not concerned with the Bills. The Dolphins is highly contingent on Tua's success. So that's why I feel like this game is so important from a fantasy perspective. The next one, though, a little bit on a lesser scale, still a divisional matchup that has a lot of weight here. The Rams and the Seahawks. This game in the NFC West is always a feisty one. I know as a Seattle fan, this is one that a lot of Seahawks fans feel like is either a must-win or you have to look good at the very least in this game in a loss to really prove that we can have staying power with this team. Because ever since Sean McVay entered the doors in LA, we've really gotten our asses handed to us in a lot of these games. And this one certainly feels like it's going to come down to a sneakily developing Rams defense versus a Geno Smith-led Seattle offense that is really trying to make the most out of a bad situation. Because right now, you're looking at DK Metcalf being out again with that MCL. You're looking at Abraham Lucas and George Fant still not coming back from injuries. And you're looking at Geno Smith having to throw the football more than he would like because of the fact that Kenneth Walker has not been effective behind that very weak offensive line. So, while it's dire straits for Seattle, there's a lot of positives for the Rams, but it still feels like a very even game. On the Rams' offensive side of things, you have a lot of potential there from a fantasy perspective, because Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, yes, there have been rumors about them. Oh, Kupp could be traded. The Puka injury could be a bit more serious than we think. But if they play, chances are they're going to have a huge impact on this game. And going up against the Seattle defense that's really struggled to find any sense of identity, that could prove to be something that both of these savvy receivers could take advantage of. So I'm not concerned about the Rams offensively. But the defense is a unit that I'm really intrigued to see in this game. Yes, it's not necessarily the best offensive line they'll face all year, but it's a chance to continue developing this momentum and continue finding their footing, because this is a young unit that really, at the start of the season, had a bit of its struggles, especially in the pass defense as well, where you see a little more veteran leadership, but still a very young unit there as well. If these young guys continue to develop, continue to generate good pressure, and most importantly can force turnovers for you, then I'm feeling really excited about what the Rams unit has on that side of the football. But I still feel like the Seattle offense is one that can score on anybody despite this offensive line ineptitudes. I feel like Geno has been very efficient. He's been getting the ball out quickly enough. And even though he's throwing at a high volume, he still has the most passing yards in the league. His completion percentage, I believe, is top 10. And Seattle really has only had issues in games where they're overwhelmed by superior opposition. They've been winning the games they should win, and that's why they're still contenders in this game and going forward. They just can find different ways to crank out wins against opponents that are inferior to them. And I don't know if the Rams are, but this certainly feels like a game that can be won by Seattle. They just have to, find a way to get different weapons going, should DK Metcalf not play in this game, which I don't think he will. And, they can find themselves making this a close one and really taking it to the Rams at home. That's why I feel like this game is so, not necessarily pivotal from a fantasy perspective, more so from a real life one, but from a fantasy perspective, could prove a lot for certain players and certain units for both of these teams. So that's why I feel like this game had to be included. Jags-Eagles, the only non-divisional game, in fact, the only interconference game that I picked for my implications this week. And this one, I like to feel will be coming down to the big play. Both of these teams are capable, and both of these quarterbacks are capable of extending the field through the air.